Good morning, everyone. We're going to now shift from the general perspective of science to the social sciences and explore what it might mean to talk about. Ivo brought out nicely some of the important differences between the natural sciences and the social sciences, or the natural phenomenon and the social phenomenon. There's also an important distinction between other biological forms and the human form. All species are purposeful. All species are seeking to sustain, survive, and grow and multiply in various ways. But as far as we know, at least by magnitude and degree, human beings can be distinguished from other animals by their capacity for conscious self-improvement, self-development, and social evolution. Human beings not only seek to live, survive, function in the way they have in the past, but we constantly seek change and we constantly seek to accomplish. And our social sciences are really about how human beings accomplish their goals. How do we create wealth? How do we create viable, harmonious forms of governance? How do we manage enterprises? How do we psychologically fulfill ourselves? How do we live effectively, harmoniously with other people? So when we use the word accomplishment, we're really talking about how human beings achieve the conscious purposes they're seeking to achieve. Whether it's status, wealth, power, success, peace, prosperity, harmony, well-being, whether those goals are intellectual, whether we're trying to discover new knowledge, or whether we're trying to discover new planets or new gold mines, we have purposeful behavior. Whether we're seeking self-realization or self-fulfillment, or we're seeking peace and prosperity for the world. So one of our fundamental questions which we're exploring this week is whether all of these things have anything in common. Whether there's anything we can say about this vast array of human purposeful behavior on which there's something in common that could constitute a basis for a science of society. If we look at the historical record, and this is too obvious to need elaboration, we see that we have a whole history of the human discovery of knowledge, of the acquisition of skills, of the development of tools and techniques, the creation of new forms of art, the organization and evolution of our social systems, the development of different social aggregates from the family or community or village or tribe up to global society, as well as we have a history of the development of individual human beings. And as it came out very well last week during our course on individuality and accomplishment, we are changing as individual human beings, not just as a species. Do any of these things have anything in common? Is there something fundamentally in common about the way we seek knowledge, the way we develop technology, social organization, and social aggregates, or the development of our individual personalities? We have another way in which we can be distinguished from the rest of living species. We not only seek to survive and maintain ourselves at a particular level and to grow and expand by reproduction to larger groupings, we also keep developing to higher levels. We acquire higher levels of knowledge, higher levels of instrumentation and technique, higher levels of social organization. We develop. And we seem to be constantly inventing and discovering new ways that were unimaginable to us in the past, that could not be predicted from the past behavior of this species, whether it was 50, 100, or 500 years ago. So this is another way, and I thought that Ivo brought it out very well when he was contrasting the natural and the social sciences, that we are a moving target. The laws of nature have remained constant for billions of years. The laws of physics have remained constant, but we are a moving target in multiple ways, which pose additional challenges in the social sciences. And I comment at this point. I thought Ivo brought it out beautifully that paradigm change is not to find fault with the past. It's to acquire new knowledge and recognize that our knowledge is very limited. The natural sciences have had hundreds of years of head start over the social sciences, and perhaps, as was discussed this morning, maybe we were even impeded to an extent by too wholeheartedly embracing what we thought were the lessons from the natural sciences. But I think what I'm trying to show today in this presentation is that the complexity of the phenomenon we're talking about are so much greater that it's quite natural that the social sciences lag behind the physical sciences in their level of integrity, their level of integration, and the level of confidence in which we can put in the knowledge that we have today. It's not to find fault with the social sciences, it's to recognize that we're evolving, and the sciences themselves are evolving, and we as a species are evolving very fast. When we talk about accomplishment, human accomplishment, I just want to carve out the territory. We're talking about everything from science and art to business and politics. We're talking about everything from the local and immediate to the global and long term. So we have spatial dimension and temporal dimension, different scales. We're not only talking about what we do physically, how much food we produce or how many houses we have or how fast our cars go. We're talking about how we relate to one another socially, emotionally, what we know, what is our knowledge, what is our understanding of ourselves in the world. Our human accomplishment is in all these multiple directions. So when we want to measure or assess change in human society, we cannot just relate it to the position and velocity or direction of an electron. We are moving in multiple dimensions at the same time. It adds to the complexity of the challenge. This is the second of two courses. The first course, we really focused predominantly on the process of individual accomplishment. Not only the individual in isolation, but we gave a great deal of importance to the contribution of individual accomplishment to the accomplishment of the society. How the individual acts as a catalyst for bringing about social change. We also looked at how the society develops the individual and helps the individual accomplish and acquire the knowledge and skills to do more. This course is a kind of a mirror image of that. We're looking at the same subject matter, but rather than focusing on the individual, we're focusing on the social collective. But here too we'll find that the individual it plays a critical and central role. So same subject looked at from different perspectives. In 1907, the United States was subject to a very severe financial crisis. In its magnitude and in intensity, it was as great as the crisis of 1929, the Great Crash. It was a banking panic that started with one trust fund in New York. The Knickerbocker Trust Fund failed and set off it put in motion a panic in the market where depositors rushed to many trusts and many banks to withdraw their funds, and as a result, the whole confidence in the financial system was rapidly declining. This directly affected the financial markets because most of the transactions on the financial markets were backed by commitments by financial agencies to meet buy and sell agreements. And if the agencies themselves failed, it meant the whole financial system would fail as well. There was no Federal Reserve at that time. There was no central bank in the United States at that time. And finally, there was no lender of last resort to back up the banks as we had in 2008. It finally came down to the work of one individual, man who Ivo mentioned earlier today, J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was not the wealthiest financier or businessman in the U.S., but he was a man, an individual whose reputation for integrity was so high that virtually he had the trust of the whole society. And when you know his philosophy, you understand that he believed the fundamental basis of his capacity to be a successful businessman was his integrity and his capacity to keep his word. So when all else failed, even the U.S. government turned to J.P. Morgan and said, is there something you can do to get us out of this crisis? Morgan called together the bankers of New York. He had no authority over them. He didn't own them. He didn't control them. And he asked them all to pitch in and create a pool of resources that would bail out banks that could be saved. He collected a small group of financial experts and asked them to go through the financial statements of the banks and decide which ones were beyond help and which ones to be saved. He was playing God in the financial markets just the way the Fed did in 2008. And things got so difficult that the president of the New York Stock Exchange said that if we don't get an additional $25 million of funding within the next 1 hour, we won't be able to keep transactions on the stock exchange, and this is likely to create a wide panic throughout the financial markets, not only in the U.S. but overseas. Morgan raised that money, just simply demanding it from the banks, over whom he had no authority. They raised $25 million in the first half an hour. 23.5 million of that was taken over, and he had just 2.5 million left for the last half hour of transactions. They made it, and the panic stopped. And as a result of that, on reflection, the U.S. Congress asked for testimony. They asked Morgan about it, and they finally took the decision, we need a central bank. What Morgan did as an individual became the institution we know as the United States Federal Reserve System. So this instance shows not only the remarkable capacity of an individual to influence the society as a whole, but it also shows something of the process by which what starts in an individual, what is expressed by his own personality and character, gets institutionalized in society as a social organization. So it shows that it shows two things for me. It shows, one, that what's happening to the individual and what happens to the collective are closely interlocked. But even more importantly, it shows that the psychological condition, the subjective reality which we cannot measure through any of our scientific tools and instruments, the subjective reality of him as an individual, his character, and of the population that accepted him and had trust in him, turned out to be critical for influencing the objective reality of whether we were going to handle this crisis. I think we'll see this coming back more and more, the relationship between the individual and the collective, and the relationship between the subjective and the objective. Now, historically, if we go through the rise of science, we find from the time of Descartes that science took a turn towards considering the objective world, the material world especially, as something separate from us. And this story illustrates that at least when it comes, leaving aside the impact of consciousness or the observer in quantum physics, it becomes clear in the social sciences that we cannot divorce the objective reality from the subjective reality. They are intimately interlinked with one another. We have a vast body of knowledge about how human beings accomplish. We know we have a science of management that tells us how to organize our people and organize our work. We have specialized fields for human activity, whether it's for production or engineering or construction or genetic engineering or whatever it may be. We have bodies of science that talk about the acquisition of specialized skills, whether it's the skills of a heart surgeon or a corporate law expert or an expert on international law. We have bodies of knowledge of how to design things, produce them, and use technologies for all different purposes, whether it's our health or to reach throughout into outer space. We have specialized knowledge about creating specialized institutions like the Fed, or creating constitutions, creating democratic governments, and so forth. So it's not that we don't have a vast amount of knowledge in the social sciences. We do. We know a lot about human beings, how we conduct and do individual separate things. There's something interesting if we reflect on how we as human beings accomplish things, especially when we want to accomplish things new for the first time, more or less the way we figured out J.P. Morgan discovered something that we needed to do in order to fix our financial system, and that is we tend to learn from experience. Trial and error, we call it. We have countless experiences, and after a lot of experience, we draw some conscious knowledge and conclusions from this. 1907 was not the first financial crisis in the United States. We had banking crisis back in 1837 and 1857 and 1894, 96, like that. We had a whole series of them. But after all of these crises, at a particular point in time, we became conscious enough to recognize that there was something we could do better in the future. We acquired a conscious knowledge. We created a Fed. But that's not the only way we accomplish. We also use the accumulated knowledge of the past, not only knowledge of our immediate past, knowledge accumulated from all of humanity in the past, and we consciously use that knowledge, pass it on to other people, so they can do without trial and error what we have learned to do, or humanity has learned to do, over hundreds or thousands of years. That's how we create heart surgeons. That's how we create engineers who can go out and create fabulous structures and design vehicles that will go to the moon. We have these two processes. So in understanding the social sciences, we have to look at both how we acquire knowledge from our experience and to where we need to acquire much more, and how effectively we are applying that knowledge, utilizing that knowledge to address the problems, opportunities, challenges that we face. When we talk about the social sciences, we're talking about not only many different subjects, but we're talking about sciences that impact on our human psychology, our aspirations, needs, and attitudes, on our mental concepts, philosophic, artistic, scientific, technological conceptions. We're talking about the values of human beings, social values, religious, spiritual, ethical values, about our perceptions, about our beliefs. All these things go into are the particles or the elements that constitute the social sciences. We're talking about institutions, the origin of power and authority in society, how we develop authority, how we exercise it. So this is a very complex field, and the question again, which we'll be asking ourselves all week is, do these things have anything in common? Is there really anything we can say about all of these diverse fields that have anything in common? Not only different fields, but different levels of reality. We're dealing with different levels of reality too. We have to deal with physical facts. How many people actually are there in this city? How many people have contracted a particular illness or a particular demographic profile or living at a particular level economically, have education or don't have education, and so forth. We're also looking at a social reality. What is a social reality? What does it look like? We can't see it. None of our five senses are a valid means for us to perceive society. We can go out into Dubrovnik and we can see hundreds of tourists walking around. We see the people walking around, but that's not the society. What's the difference between 100 tourists individually walking around and a marriage party that's taken over Dubrovnik for the day and all have come to celebrate an event? What's the difference between a man and woman who are walking next to each other and a husband and wife who are walking there? We can't see husband and wife. We can only infer it by their behavior or by their own statements. The social reality is not a physical reality, but we know it's enormously powerful. It's as solid and powerful as the concrete walls that we can't go through. It even prevents us from thinking things that other people don't think or that we have been taught are unthinkable or impossible. So it's very concrete reality, but it's not a physical reality. It consists of perceptions, attitudes, social institutions, and social power. Not the power that we see of a physical object or a machine that's pushing things or the power of a river, but power nonetheless that moves human beings. And we're also talking about a totally invisible psychological reality. J.P. Morgan's character is real. It had a real impact on the world. But even today, we find it very hard to measure or assess and distinguish his character from many others. We try, and there are scientific methods for that, but we can't see it. We can only really assess it by its behavior, by its result. It's not something we can see directly. Our beliefs. I can't see into your minds. I can't see your thoughts. I can't see your beliefs. I can see whether you're sleeping or whether you're smiling or whether you're agreeing or whether you're disagreeing as a symptom, or maybe you're thinking of something totally different at this time. I can only infer values, aspirations. So when we come to the social sciences, if in fact there is any relationship between them, it's got to be a relationship that covers at least these three different planes of reality. Whereas in the physical sciences, we're pretty well focused on just the first of these, just physical phenomena. So we're talking about levels of complexity, levels of interaction that are infinitely more greater, as Ivo said, than in the physical sciences. There was a sequel to J.P. Morgan's experience. We all know about it. In 1929, there was a great crash. It was a repetition. The only difference was that we had a U.S. Federal Reserve by that time. The magnitude was pretty much the same. Unfortunately, we had an institution, but it doesn't mean we had the knowledge necessary to use that institution effectively. And there's good cause to believe that actually the Fed may have made things worse by a lot of the things it did. So having the institution without that intangible, immeasurable thing we call knowledge doesn't necessarily get us the results we want. By 1933, the unemployment had risen from, unemployment in the U.S. was at historically very low levels because we always had a shortage of people in this huge territory. It had gone up to 25%, which was unprecedented in the history of the country. There had been 6,000 banks that had failed. 6,000, there was about 25% of the banks that actually failed. People went to get their money out of the banks, and there was no money left. And that's not surprising because if you go to the soundest bank in the world and if every depositor goes to collect their money, any bank will fail by definition because all that money's been lent out to other people. Industrial production was down by 50%. In March of 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took over as the President of the United States, He was not an economist, and in fact, there was really no economist who could have a remedy for this. They had been trying pretty much everything in the previous 3 years while it was getting worse. Roosevelt got on the radio in the first of his famous fireside chats, and he addressed the American people. You can listen to it on YouTube if you want. He addressed the American people, and he said that all the rich natural resources that made this country prosperous are still there. All the talented, enterprising, skilled people are still there. We have all the factories that we had 3 years ago. What have we lost? What's different now? What's different is we've lost our confidence. We've lost our trust in America. We've given in to fear. And he made that very famous speech where he said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. What kind of economic remedy is this? When 6,000 banks have failed, you get somebody and gives you a pep talk. And he says, now I'm going to open the banks again on Monday, and I want you to go back to the banks, and I want you to redeposit all your money in the banks. Not exactly the kind of remedy that you would expect from an economic analysis. And the week before, the lines that were out there at the banks all over the country, the only reason there weren't more failures is it took so long to give people their money that the banks could go slow, and by the time the day was ended, there was still some money left. Not everybody. So they were going to go back, he knew. But he said, be proud, loyal, courageous Americans, go back to the bank on Monday, but take whatever money you have and put it back in the bank. And they did it. By and large, they did it. And the banking crisis stopped, and the failure of the bank stopped. Now, he did many other things also. He introduced the depositors insurance, and they did a lot of other things. I'm simplifying it. But I wanted to stress this particular point because it really brings out what, unfortunately, we forget very often in economics until a panic comes, that the fundamental basis of our economic system, our social system, is human trust, is psychological. It's a subjective reality. If I have a 500 euro note here and I offer it in exchange for, or 2,000 euros and I offer it in exchange for your computers, maybe some of you will feel that's a good buy. I can get a much better one for that. But if you think that my note is counterfeit, you'll say, what am I doing? It's useless to me. Because your attitude, the note may not be counterfeit. But if you believe it's counterfeit, that's enough to prevent this from happening. Your attitude about it is a prime determining factor. And this is what FDR showed, that fundamentally the substratum of our social system is a sense of trust and attitudes, fear or courage. And this, if we're talking about a science of society, we have to be able to marry the objective and the subjective dimensions of reality. Well, he not only went on to regulate the banks and usher in the New Deal, which brought in a social welfare system to a country that was the most capitalist and individualistic in the world. He went on to form the basis for the founding of the United Nations and was a strong force for the abolition of colonialism, pressed on the British and the other allies to give up their colonies after the end of the war. He even had a plan in place. Winston, who's joining us tonight, will talk more about it. He wanted to introduce a second Bill of Rights in the United States, and the first of those Bill of Rights would be the right to employment. Something unbelievable, sounds almost like communism. Of course, that's not what he had in mind. But to say the government has a responsibility to see that everybody has a job. So this was a remarkable man who, not because he was a trained economist, but because he understood something about the way society works, people work. When we talk about human accomplishment in any context, we're really talking about multiple spheres that are interacting with each other. Both of these stories about Morgan and FDR highlight the importance of the role of the individual in any social achievement. And we'll come back to that again. It also shows how important the social context is, the social milieu is, the environment is in which individuals are acting. In the case, it shows the importance of groups and organizations. In this case, it was the U.S. government. In Morgan's case, it was an informal group of bankers who got together and agreed to act in concert to save the system. We know also, and we've learned through hard experience, that we cannot function our society ignoring the physical environment in which we live. And we're having to come to terms with the impacts of that now. And there's one other element that impacts on all human accomplishment, and that is which we call life, the specific events that take place at a particular moment in time and space. And if we're going to come to anything like a knowledge of society, we're going to have a knowledge that encompasses all of these dimensions. Certainly a daunting task, which may help us explain why we haven't had one up until now. I think most of you may recognize this young group. This was Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in a garage in 1976 when they invented the first Apple computer. They were one of the first, not the only one, but their technology, Wozniak was a genius. He was the first one to connect the keyboard so that you could type on and see what you typed on a screen using a keyboard as for inputs instead of punch cards and other things. And he was a master at designing motherboards. And their computer became successful. By 1984, it was a $2 billion company. They brought in a professional board. They had gone public. They brought in a guy named John Scully, who had been the president of Pepsi, to professionalize them. And one of the first things Scully and the board did was to throw Steve Jobs out. They said, you may be a master designer, but you're absolutely a disaster as a manager in this company, and you're going and you're undermining the authority everywhere, you've got everybody competing and fighting against each other, and we'll be better off without you. So by 1985, Jobs was out. He went and said he was humiliated, publicly humiliated. He thought of moving from Silicon Valley because it was so embarrassing for him. But instead of that, he decided to prove everybody wrong by creating his own company and not making the mistake of bringing in any of these people. He created Next Computer. He invested $50 million to make the perfect computer in the perfect factory, to do everything the way he thought it should be done without the influence of all these Wall Street and Madison Avenue types. The result was he built a factory that could produce 40,000 computers a month, and he was selling about 400 a month. The company was a complete bust. He then went on and he invested in Lucas's first name for Star Wars? Forget his first name. The producer who produced Star Wars. George Lucas. George Lucas had created a computer company, to make computers and software that could create computerized animation, which didn't exist at that time. This was in about 87. And Lucas couldn't make the company profitable. Jobs liked the idea, so he bought the company for $7 million from Lucas. And he found out, sure enough, that there's not a great deal of popular demand for $35,000 or $40,000 computers that can enable you to make animated computerized movies. This is not something that's going to be a hot seller among the young generation. And he already had been selling to the Disneys and Warner Brothers and people like that, but they needed very few of these things. He started bleeding cash. The company, he had to lay off workers. It looked like he had made another drastic mistake. And there was a young guy named John Lasseter who was in a department not related to computer production at all. His job was to make films using this technology that he could use to market the computers and show how good they were. And he came up with a film script for a 3-minute animated cartoon called Tiny Toy. And he told Jobs, I need $250,000 in order to complete this. And Jobs said, already my company's bleeding money. I've lost $7 million. You want me to throw another $250,000 against a cartoon? But he did it. And he saw it, he did it. That cartoon won that 3-minute film won the Academy Award, the first computer-generated animated film, short film, won the Academy Award. Disney approached them and said, we want to make it into a full-length motion picture. It became Toy Story. They spent $50 million on it, and it generated about $280 million in revenues. And from then on, Pixar rose as a star in the field, and finally Steve Jobs sold it to Disney for $7 billion. The company he had invested $7 million in. And he was on his way back. Then Apple, by that time Apple had gone from 15% market share to 5% market share. They didn't know what to do. Michael Dell was advising them to close the company. And they said, let's bring Jobs back. 1998, they brought him back. And in a history we all know about, in a quick succession, he introduced the iMac, then the iPod, changed the whole business of Apple. So almost half their revenue was coming from selling music rather than selling computers. Then the iPad, the iPhone, opened the Apple stores, the iPad, with the result that a couple of years after he died, Apple is a $171 billion company. When I went in there in 84, it was $2 billion. 98,000 employees, and it's the world's most valuable company, more than $600 billion in market cap. One man did this, and I think we all know he has changed the world and changed the way many people live and been an inspiration for so much that has gone after him from the graphic user interface on out. So if we're going to talk about a science of society, we're going to have to somehow be able to take into account the fact that an individual or a small group of individuals or a small organization, whether it's an Apple or a Google or an Amazon or somebody else, whether it's a business organization or a Grameen Bank or something else, can have a disproportionate impact on the world as a whole. Quite a daunting challenge for us to even contemplate. And things are even more complicated than that, as Roberto already brought out in his comment to Ivo. Because it's not enough in the social sciences that we take into account the history of what's happened in the past or what are the factors and forces that are active in the moment. We also have to take into account what we think or what we hope or what we wish or what we fear is going to happen in the future. Anticipation. Because we know as human beings, we are powerfully motivated and influenced by our perception, our expectations, our anticipations of the future. So it's not enough we look for causality that comes from the past. We're going to have to also understand that the role of the future in influencing what happens today, right now. In addition to that, and I'm talking to the point that Ivo made, I thought it was a really important point this morning. I'm just kind of elaborating on it. We are a moving target. Humanity is not like the laws of physical nature, which are constant for billions of years. We are constantly changing. We see the rate of that change, which we call social development, is faster than ever before, and it's accelerating. We are not only changing in time the way we do things, but we're spreading out and interconnecting with each other. We're connecting from the local level now to the global level. There's a geographic dimension, a spatial dimension in this. We are constantly acquiring new knowledge. As Ivo rightly said, we're not the same at the end of his lecture as we were at the beginning of the lecture. And humanity's doing this on an infinite scale from day to day, year to year. Our organizations are growing in sophistication, growing in size, growing in power and magnitude, growing at different levels. The integration between different fields of human activity are constantly growing, getting closer and closer. And the best example we have, which we can all understand, is the Internet. Because now we've got a global social organization in which it links together so many of our activities. Our religious preferences, our educational activities, our tourist and travel arrangements, our e-commerce, our music and entertainment, so many things getting integrated within a common social organization. One of the themes that came out of last week's discussion is that it looks like there's a good deal of evidence for the fact that we as human beings are also becoming more individualized, more unique, more emphasizing our capacities for different understanding, different values, different actions than people in the past. We spent a lot of time exploring that. And the complexity of all of these factors combining together certainly reaches a level of complexity way beyond what we have seen in the physical sciences. So we're a moving target. So I raised the question, and maybe you think I've already answered the question and given why there is no science of accomplishment, or why is there no science of society that integrates all of these areas. There seems to be a good reason for it. The fields of activity seem to be subject to very different laws. The laws, if you talk to the economist, he talks to you about economic principles. He doesn't talk about psychological principles, sociological principles, principles relevant to military warfare or diplomacy. The subject seems to be too broad in scope. We do much better as human beings when we specialize and concentrate on something that's limited. There seem to be too large a number of interacting variables. The reality seems to be too complex. And we can certainly say, I think, that we don't have today as a shared vision of how these multiple dimensions, multiple levels, multiple fields of social reality relate to each other. We're still so much focused on looking at each one separately. We know they relate to each other. Every economist, the moment things go wrong, he says, well, it's because of the public policy. It's because of what the politicians have done. My formulas work, my laws work, my principles work. It would work if there were no political system, or if the political system never changed. And we know how realistic that is. So we raised the question, and we're not trying to answer that question this morning, but I think it would be interesting to come back and talk about that and see what we think about it by the end of the week. Is a science of accomplishment or a science of society possible? Are there common underlying principles applicable to all fields of accomplishment? Do they really have anything in common? In the physical sciences, or rather in the natural sciences, Ivo pointed it out very nicely. It doesn't matter whether you're a geneticist or a zoologist or a heart surgeon. The subatomic particle, the atom, the molecular bonds, the basic fundamental principles that govern atoms and molecules remain the same in all phenomena, whether we're talking about mountains or comets or the biology of human beings. Do we know of any underlying principles in the social sciences that are common to all fields? We use different terminology. We use different concepts. Are there any principles? Can we find or identify anything that is really common to all of the fields of society? That's one of the questions we'd like to explore this week. Are there any common processes? in physics, in chemistry, in biology, we know of many common processes, whether it's metabolism or respiration or photosynthesis or whatever it is. Are there any really common processes that are common to all the fields of social science? And we would have to try to understand what's the relationship between the individual, the organization, the society, the physical environment in which we live, and the particular conditions at a moment in time. Ivo's already talked to this. I'd just like to highlight a few differences between the natural and the social sciences. We do have in the natural sciences a hierarchy of fundamental principles, and one science doesn't contradict the others, I believe. In the social sciences, each one seems to be founded on a different set of concepts, premises, and principles. The natural sciences focus on studying an objective, external reality. The social sciences, my examples were meant to illustrate that we cannot exclude the subjective, non-material levels of reality in any social science. The complexity in the natural sciences, as great as it can be, is relatively less so than when we have to take into account the interaction between physical, social, and psychological phenomena in the social sciences. As Ivo mentioned, the laws governing the natural scientists appear at least to be immutable, whereas the laws governing the social sciences are man-made or human-made laws. We decide how our economies work. We decide how our political systems work. And in the natural sciences, we tend to classify things. Things readily fall into categories. We can talk about so many different types of quarks and subatomic particles, so many different categories of atoms, so many types of molecules. Things fit neatly into classification as groups. And we've certainly tried to do that in the social sciences, but when we get down and look more closely, we keep running up to this obstacle which we call individuality or uniqueness, which seems to make it difficult to pin things down and make generalizations about them. We've called this course towards a transdisciplinary science of society. And maybe this is the first step on a million-step process. We don't say how far we're going to get in that process. But what do we mean by transdisciplinarity? Transdisciplinary concern, what's the difference between transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, all of which have been around for a long time? We're talking about that which is at once between disciplines, across the different disciplines, and beyond each of the individual disciplines. Something more fundamental that they would all have in common, which is not just the purview of one or the other. A transdisciplinary social science would have to be based on the premise that human society and individuality cannot be adequately understood simply in positivistic terms, that is, in terms of externalities or behaviors, or reductionist terms in meaning by trying to subdivide everything into smaller and smaller pieces, by mere formalism, or by concluding that by a premise that all human behavior really is a question of physical phenomena. As long as these premises have any validity for us, we are not likely to make headway on a science of society. If there is to be such a science, it implies that there should be fundamental concepts, forces, processes, and characteristics that underlie all social phenomena, knowledge of which can generate greater understanding and effectiveness. And this is one of the things we're really going to be looking for this week, to see whether we can identify, or people have already identified, some fundamental constructs, forces, and processes and characteristics that really are common to the different social sciences. Well, we already have examples, fortunately, that would support or give us some encouragement in this field. We've had tremendous developments in the field of systems theory, complexity, information theory, ecological thinking, and now recently with Roberto's work and his group on anticipatory systems, all of which are based on the premise that there are principles and processes which transcend any particular discipline. They're not limited to any discipline. And this knowledge that's been accumulating over the last 50 years has given a great impetus to this effort. Because it shows that there really are parallels and similarities and commonalities between phenomena that we once thought were quite disparate from one another. Tonight we'll be joined by Winston Nagin, who's a professor of law in Florida. He's the chairman of the board of the Academy. His mentor and one of the past presidents of the World Academy was Harold Laswell, a brilliant legal mind from Yale, who really formulated, he didn't call it that, but he really formulated a concept that linked social processes, power and political processes, and legal processes, and showed them as part of a fundamental continuity. May not be comprehensive in all his way, but I think you'll see when Winston presents it that he integrates the subjective and the objective realms of reality, the physical, the social, the psychological realms of reality, and which gives us some reason to think I think the problem that Laswell had was within the field of law, this was way more than legal theorists wanted to deal with. They wanted to deal with law as if it's in its own compartment and it can be handled at that way without taking into account the others. And incidentally, one of Laswell's students, who's also a fellow of the Academy, Michael Reisman, also from Yale, he made an original contribution by tracing the origin of law right down to the individual, what he calls micro-law. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that in the next few days. So there's some reason to believe that some elements are already there. And one of the things we want to do this week is give due recognition to all those efforts that may be tending in this direction. What can we learn from their achievements as well as what we can learn from their limitations? The rationale for this course, which Ivo mentioned early in his address, is today we confront multidimensional challenges that seem to defy comprehension and resolution based on our prevailing knowledge in the social sciences. And as the philosopher of science Karl Popper emphasized, when you're dealing with the natural sciences, your job as a scientist is to study the way nature works. But when you're in social sciences, your principal responsibility is how to make the human society work better. This is a purposeful behavior. This is not just a question of finding out something that's an independent reality to us, but how do we learn more about the way we as human beings live and accomplish so that we can fulfill our aspirations and accomplish more? That knowledge is real power. And wherever we see a crisis today, whether it's in ecology or in finance or in employment or poverty or psychological alienation or health, it's because we look closely, we can see that there's knowledge missing here. There's something about the way we are approaching our activities that is insufficient, taking into account the reality. And Alberto is going to talk strongly to that when he shares with us some insights on education, on healthcare, and on psychological well-being of people as well, as he did last week. So I think I'd like to stop here. I've just listed some course objectives, and I've also listed a set of questions, but I think I've raised those pretty well in the course. My purpose was not to give any answers here, but to put out a set of questions that we could explore during the week. What's the role of the subjective field in a science of society? What's the role of the individual? In what way can we see a commonality of stages in the development of human activity in different fields, which I call labeled for the moment growth, development, evolution, whether it's in politics or economics or law or science or in other fields. These are some of the questions that I believe will be coming up, will be addressed. I'd like to stop there and open it up for comments or questions. Alberto.
Well, very good, and you've been able to condensate a lot of important material in a very smooth way. I'm really envious how well you do it. I agree with everything you said. My question to you is, since I agree that there is a lot of knowledge that we have acquired, and that knowledge is power, well, don't you think also that there is another darker side of the moon, that there is an enormous amount of lack of knowledge, available knowledge, on how we fail repeatedly so badly. With all the knowledge we know, how come we fail so big? And also, the issue, knowledge is power. Yes, absolutely, I agree totally with you. But, to understand what is going on, would it be also important to see why people and nations that have power try with every means, very powerful means, to stop other nations and other people to have power. and the power dynamics that I think are underlining all the aspects, not only of human life, but life in general.
I think so. Yes. Go ahead, Carlos.
Maybe you want to react to this.
Well, I think it's such an important point. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because in Laswell's model, power is right in the middle. And that's really what he's talking about. That's not the way we're taught economics. We're not taught that our economic system is a result of the fact that money power in what we call a democracy, which is largely a plutocracy, is really driving the economic system and the rules that we make and the policies and the tax rates and everything. So one of the important points for us is to make explicit things that are now implicit. And if we do that, I think by definition, we're going to be moving away from the reductionist mode of the separate disciplines and seeing the vast web of interconnections that are there before our very eyes.
Absolutely.
Very important point. Carlos and then Eva.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, first, thank you for your presentation. And building up on what Alberto just said, I would say a few comments. One is that knowledge in social sciences is not only in social sciences, but that's especially true in that case, is always historical and contingent in particular on politics. So because you made a very good point on the history of the financial crisis in 1907 and then 1929 and the role of Roosevelt. But somehow we managed to forget that knowledge, part of that knowledge. The current crisis is at least partially due to the fact that the U.S. decided to forget the knowledge they developed when the crisis of 1929. So they changed the rules and they deregulated the game, the financial system, and then suddenly the financial crisis started to come back again. So we are also able, as a social systems, to forget the knowledge we have acquired. So, but this is only a point because you make a very bold hypothesis, which is attractive, appealing, but it is bold that to say there are fundamental constructs, forces, processes, and characteristics that underlie all social processes. And so I have been
It's
thinking...
intended as a challenge.
Yes.
It's intended to be provocative and controversial.
Yeah. No, I sometimes I've been thinking about that since you sent this document, and I would say I make a couple of guesses. One is that one of those principles is exactly that in social sciences, knowledge, purposes of that knowledge, and the framework of interpretation and use are intimately intertwined. We are not building, there is not such thing as an objective knowledge in social sciences. That would be one of the principles I would set. The knowledge we develop in social science is always related to some purposes of all of this knowledge are related to a specific framework of interpretation, which means that we have to be one of the things with that view in mind. One of the things we should have to do is to make explicitly the hermeneutics of each social knowledge we develop. Because if not, if we say we are developing objective social sciences, this is the gateway to ideology. For instance, which happened in economics in the last 30 years. They pretended in neoclassical or neoliberalism school of economics pretended to develop an objective knowledge about economics and make it work as if it was a machine,
Exactly.
which comes back to, which is much older as an intention, and that was very well analyzed in the Great Transformation book by Carlo Polanyi, that intention to separate economy from the rest of society and make us believe that economy is a machine which should work like a car works on which has clear and objective principles. So when you forget about that, what you produce is ideology. So that's one principle. And two more comments or two more ideas I throw on the table. I think the one area where there clearly lack of knowledge is understanding of how the structures and the purposes relate to each other, and how the same structures may have purposes which evolve over time. And my favorite example for that is that the purposes of the states, the nation states, have evolved immensely over time. So they are not the same structures they used to be, but they have many commonalities, head of state, and structure to impose violence and to impose taxes and some other commonalities, and they became, centuries ago, they were instruments in the hands of aristocracies, and today they may be, I'm not saying they are always that, but they may be welfare states. And the last comment I put on the table, and that's very personal, the pure guess, I have not built a theory on this, but maybe, and is that one principle we could play around with is called the principle of generosity, which is that the advancement of humanity, of society, when you dig out enough, I think you get to the point that this advancement is based on more generosity, not only at the individual level, but at the social level, that we are able to build up things which enable social generosity, which is quite contrary to the view that we all pursue our selfish interests and that's the way it works. Very much contrary to what you so.
Thank you. I'd like to respond before I forget all the points you've made, and then I think, Roberto, you had something? Okay.
I may eventually continue this last point together with Alberto's problem of power. I think that the way in which we conceptualize power is pretty hollow, pretty superficial, in the sense that the basic idea is that power is a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. What I have, you do not have. Mm-hmm. And that's why all the competitions and the struggles and whatever. But it's another possibility to conceptualize power. Not only the power of somebody against somebody else, which is the zero-sum game, but it's the power of doing things together. The first together with the second. And at that point, power is no more a zero-sum game. Because more power arises as soon as we learn to do things together. Moreover, the flow, what makes the first conception wrong has to do with which is the basic, the most deep kind of relation that is able to make a society possible. Let's think about competition, one against the other, from which the traditional understanding of power arises. But below competition, there must be something else, cooperation. There is no possibility to live together without some degree of cooperation, which implies that the other understanding of power, which seems something like utopian or, something, in the end, is possibly the most natural understanding of power we can develop. And that makes things completely different.
Right.
So your solidarity here, it has a natural basis.
I cannot agree more.
Ivo, did you?
Thank you for your excellent speech and opened a number of very important questions, and of course, to make things worse in a way, Alberto, Carlos, and Roberto added even more. Let me try to share some of my own confusion as it came after all of these, my own talk, and then of course your talk and all of these things. One thing is actually in science, typically in what we like to do in this mechanic science, let's say, we like the reproducibility. And if something is not reproducible, then we are almost on the verge of saying this is not scientific. Because we believe that that's the basis of objectivity. Now going back to what you mentioned, the action of J.P. Morgan, and then you could say, and of course, later on, more or less re-emphasized. So there are two experiments showing two actions in the same line. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his famous, listening to figure is the figure itself. Okay. Now, whatever we think of next American presidents, with their huge amount of advisors, they obviously knew all this. Why Bush did not repeat the same action? That would be just something that, somebody who's making the car and wants to make another car would look how it was made 50 or 100 years ago, and then does whatever Ford did it and just makes a better car. Why Bush didn't do it? Why he actually was totally silent at the time of the crisis in 2007, 2008. Now this brings to an important question that we had with us after the discussion of my talk, which actually throws the deep question on the issue of time. Time is quite all right when we talk on something which is mechanical system of our size, meter, second, and so on. When we go to something else, either we move in a society or we move somewhere else, then this reproducibility obviously seems to fail. And this is linked, of course, with something that we have no idea, though we intuitively know what do we mean. I mean, when you use the word trust, all of us behave as if we understand what you are saying. But do we really? Do we know how to measure trust? For instance, we know how to measure distances. We have a meter and blah, blah, do this, but do we know how to measure trust? Why people trusted Delano Roosevelt, and why, for instance, most of the American citizens did not trust Bush, or now, for that matter, I don't know, whether there is any politician that people trust at all in the world. So where is this? I think this is one thing. So this is my comment and the conclusion which I have. Now, one thing which I would like to somewhat slightly disagree with, I think the tendency we are going, and actually I started this, you even reinforced that. The point was that we somehow wanted to say, there are natural sciences and there are social sciences, and they are distinctly different. Let me disagree with this, that they are distinctly different, and say that actually there is more commonality than we think about. First was already this question of the time. The second is ask a very simple question in natural sciences. And by the way, when I was talking about natural sciences, I was often using the word physical sciences. You went considerably ahead when you used geology and things like that, which are life sciences, and there is much more of a problem that I see. And let me tell you, for instance, one field, and we will hear more from Alberto about psychology. Psychology is now so deeply intertwined with neurosciences, with neurosurgery, with things that look very much, almost objective, that really we don't know what indeed they are. So I would be very, very concerned about going to this step in life sciences, because I don't know. I think this is more complicated. Particularly this, for instance, a number of things that you have in medicine, where you have the effect of healing through just feeling good, and then you kill yourself. There is this feedback which I think is beyond at least my understanding of that would be said. Saying, okay, but now the basic link between natural sciences and or even physical sciences and social sciences. First, everything in social sciences is focused on a human being. Now, two comments. One is, all technologies that we have, starting from mining to building ships to any new technology, is basically part of the social science, because it deals with the human being. The second comment which I want to make is that in physics, basically, we ask a simple question about why, for instance, the electron has the mass it has. The only answer is so that human beings could be here. So the human beings in natural sciences is again at the center of everything. And that is somehow, in these two ways, I see the connection, and I think we should try to stress this connection so that we don't end up in disagreement.
I think it's an important point, and I didn't mean to cut it off, because I think when you come back to your presentation, I can raise it. But just to clarify, I wasn't trying to say they're identical. I was only trying to say, at least I did use the word in degree. There are significant differences, and we should keep that in mind. Our subject matter is not whether they're the same or different. Our subject matter is whether or not we can rely on this paradigm in our approach to the social sciences. I'd just like to make very quick responses to a few very important remarks that have been made. And then, because we couldn't hear Ashok before, and he's again to ask a question, let's give him a chance. We want our remote participants also to present. I thought, Carlos, the point you made about the importance of the subjective in the social sciences and how to marry it with the objective knowledge. Fareed Zakaria wrote a book, The Future of Freedom, talking about democracy. We tend in political science to think about democracy as a structure that works in a particular way, like a system. His whole point was that what we in the West call democracy is founded on a culture of liberalism that evolved over hundreds and hundreds of years, centuries, And it is that which makes this mechanism work the way it does. It's not what's stated in the Constitution. So it was just an example to reinforce the significance of that. And so in our exploration, we want to identify points like that. We want to identify the interaction, as Ivo mentioned, the placebo effect or the psychological impact in medicine. That is social science to me. The perfectly great example, where the subjective and the objective are interacting. Also, as a suggestion as we go through the week, because we have people coming from different disciplines, law, political science, economics, and sociology, and so forth, let's also give a good attention to the places where a particular science stops on, depends on, or postulates certain conditions about the influence of the others around it. The simple example is in microeconomics, where they talk about the laws governing competition. The supply equals demand perfectly under these 22 assumptions, which never exist, and of course, which have very much to do with non-economic phenomenon. So one of the ways we can go about exploring this is to look at those linkages and see what we can learn from them. And just finally, I thought Roberto's statement is so important that power is not a zero-sum game. In fact, I think Janani is going to be talking to that topic tomorrow. It's very important, and we'll come back to it. So now, granted that we're way behind schedule, and it's not fair to Alberto, I apologize, Alberto. But let's just hear a show. If you have a question, we'll hear it now.
Yes, I have a comment.
Please go ahead.
Gary, you say that the world needs a transdisciplinary approach. But as you yourself say, mind is divisive and somewhat segmenting. So it's inevitable that knowledge tends to become specialized and gets isolated into compartments that don't combine with the other disciplines. Transdisciplinary approach requires a vision of the whole. Mind, by its very nature, is incapable of such a unified, integrated vision. So how do you ever hope to achieve this transdisciplinary approach while still using the divisive nature of mind as the means of knowledge?
Ashok, it's an excellent question, and it comes back to my presentation last Friday or Saturday morning, which unfortunately most of the group has missed. I will try to come back to it in subsequent lectures, but my brief answer is I didn't say that the mind is incapable. I said mind has I have said things about what the mind's good at. The mind is very good at concentrating on a particular part of reality and treating that part as if it's the whole. There's no doubt about it. And that's the origin of the reductionist tendency we have. It doesn't mean that mind is incapable of looking at relationships and seeing the aggregates and exploring the interconnections, which is exactly what systems theory is trying to do, and other more holistic ecology is trying to do. So I agree that there's a propensity of mind. How far we'll be capable, how far the rational faculty will be capable of handling the complexity that we're talking about this morning is a really good question. And I'd suggest let's come back to it later in the week and see whether we have greater insight into it. I really appreciate the question. Thank you. Okay.